Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Josho Brouwers, and I'm joined tonight by Joshua Hall and Roel Konijnendijk. We thought long and hard about the kind of subject we wanted to talk about for our very first episode, and we decided to pick as a subject, why do we study the ancient world? We don't want to talk in particular just about why we personally study the ancient world, but that's what we kick off with. Starting with Josh.
So my interest in the ancient world actually started not because of Rome or the Greeks themselves, but thanks to my mild obsession starting in high school with Machiavelli. And before I read any ancient history, anything, whether modern book or primary source, I read the discourses on Livy. And that's pretty much what got me into wanting to take a couple of ancient history courses at university. And when I changed majors from chemistry over to history, it stuck.
So this is entirely about the extent to which ancient studies continue to be relevant sort of through the ages, and how they become sort of adopted and analyzed by later peoples, and how this sort of carries us through right the way through to the modern era. Is that what you're saying?
I wasn't trying to make any profound statement at all. I was just more or less giving my personal reasoning.
No, I just thought that would be the way that we were going to do this. I'm sure you're going to cut this out, but basically that you're not just talking about how I got into this, because that is a very sort of personal story, which obviously is interesting too. But also why do we study in a sort of more abstract sense?
Yeah, in a general sense, but I thought it would be good to sort of start with, why did we personally get involved, and why would one study the ancient world? What's the use of that? Because a lot of the time nowadays it's all discussions about, what's the use of studying this particular thing? And I'm pretty sure you all got the same response that I did when I told people, back in the day, I'm studying archaeology, and they would go like, oh, well, that's nice. What do you want to do when you're finished? Okay, so you do this archaeology thing, and then when you're done, what are you actually going to do for real work? That sort of thing. I think there's a good answer to give about why you would study the ancient world, what the point of that is. There are a few answers, I think. So, but I was curious first to hear what your ideas would be. So maybe Roel can also say why he came into this particular field from a personal point of view, and then...
Yeah, it's kind of something that I don't remember. I remember that from fairly early age, I was always really fascinated by ancient Greece in particular, and I'm not quite sure why. I don't know where that come from, or when it began, or how it developed. It's just that when I came to university, in the years before that, I was totally obsessed with World War II, like a typical teenager, I guess. And I already knew that wasn't really what I wanted to study in university. It wasn't really something I wanted to specialize in, because it was more of a hobby. So I was still sort of open-minded about what I might do, and what I might sort of make my field. And then right from the get-go, basically, ancient history was the subject that I found most fascinating. And when they started offering courses specifically on Greek warfare, I realized that had a lot to do with the kind of things that I was consuming in pop culture at the time. I was playing a lot of video games that had to do with this, so it kind of put me on track of going what if I can be an expert in this? What if I can be the guy who actually knows how this works, rather than somebody who's just playing the games and hoping that what you're being shown is more or less accurate. What if I could correct this, or what if I could write this? What if I could be an expert on that particular topic? And that's really kind of something that stuck with me, because 12 years later, I'm still studying the same thing. I'm still studying Greek warfare.
For me, it's very simple. I was interested in stories, especially mythology and folklore and legend and that sort of stuff. And I got really obsessed with Arthurian myth and legend. And that sort of led me to wanting to find out the origins of those particular stories. And that led to studying late Roman history. And sources for that, and then you start thinking, okay, where do the Romans come from as far as stories and mythology is concerned? And I ended up with the Greeks, and I sort of stuck there. So that's how I got into saying I want to study the ancient Greeks, and there were more reasons that we will get into later. I think it's slightly more for the general topic.
So you came in from Arthurian legend all the way down into Greek myths, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I moved all the way from, let's say, Dark Age Britain went to Italy and finally ended up in Greece. And yeah.
You've never decided to sort of go back to Arthurian legends? Like, is there that has never been sort of the ultimate goal, like to try and...
No, because I sort of the Greeks got their hooks in me, and I was like, okay, well, this is sort of like this ancient thing that I can study that has all this rich stories and stuff, and Homer, and so sort of got stuck there. One of the things I wanted to do with my PhD, which was on early Greek warfare, was do a comparison between Homeric epic and Germanic epic, let's say, so especially Beowulf. But that my supervisor knew nothing about that, so he said, "Nope, not gonna happen." So we just stuck to the to the ancient Greek stuff. So, but it's so yeah, would have been interesting.
So when you say Livy, like Livy had your fascination, or arriving at Livy through Machiavelli, like surely Livy is just one source. How does that make you sort of excited about doing ancient history as a whole?
It was more about what he represented to Machiavelli, because I've always been interested in politics and essentially how society is formed and how society actually functions, because to me it doesn't seem like it should, and Livy gives one great explanation for why society works, which is the Roman Republican model. And it was almost more of an interest in ancient politics more than necessarily ancient history itself or the ancient world. Of course, I've moved on past that, but that was really what got me interested in pursuing ancient studies further than just, a couple of courses in the second year of my undergraduate. I think Livy was a great starting place because he really does introduce you to a wonderful, wonderful world to think about, which is early Rome, which, as we all know, is better than early Greece. So, just objectively.
Well, I will let that slide for now. One of the things that tell me.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say another part of it is being an American. All through middle school and high school, I read a lot of American history and was a very patriotic young boy back in the day. And obviously, my country was founded on a lot of ideals taken from people like Livy, and that helped foster the interest, again, from more of a political science type of standpoint rather than historical in the beginning.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things that I've found appealing is sort of taking those ideas and turning them on their head. Like the notion that a modern democracy was born in Athens, and that kind of nonsense, which presupposes a continuity that simply is assumed and didn't really exist.
No.
There is no continuity from classical Athens to the modern age. It was a deliberate callback by later people to say, oh, we're founding a democracy after the model of ancient Athens, supposedly, even though it was completely different. That was sort of the thing that got me interested, as well as my particular field, the one that I eventually picked to write my master's thesis about, and eventually my PhD, which is Greek warfare. And I was like, thing is that I picked that particular topic because I couldn't understand. First of all, I needed a topic, of course, and the reason I picked that was because I didn't understand why people would wage wars. Why do you fight each other when you can also just sit around a table and talk about it in a civilized way and solve your problems that way? So one of the things that I thought would be useful was to take an ancient culture, in this particular case ancient Greece, because I was mildly obsessed with that, and study warfare in ancient Greece, so a culture that was remote in time and space, sort of like putting it under a microscope and looking at it and figuring out, why do people in ancient Greece fight wars, and can this tell me something about why people today fight wars? And the answer is no. But it's the process is ongoing, let's say, and it's one of the things that I always say that's why, in my view, you would study the ancient world, is to sort of have this you can conduct this lab experiment where you have this ancient culture. You just ask questions and see where that leads to and what it says about the human condition in a general sense. So that's one of the things that I would say one of the aspects of why would one study the ancient world. This is one of the reasons why you would do that, I think.
Yeah, picking up on that, I think one of the things that really got me sort of hooked on it is the idea that when you start looking into it, there's a lot of stuff that we think about the ancient Greeks, as you said, like the idea that they founded democracy, the idea that they're the origin of modern rational thinking and philosophy and science, and that when you actually start looking into it, you can question a lot of that. You can say, actually, that's not really what these sources reflect, or maybe we should need to nuance this image, or maybe this is just outright wrong. And it's specifically that the extent to which you can clearly see that people use ancient Greece in this way as a sort of lab experiment that allows them to draw conclusions that they then apply to the modern world as something that they want to sort of appropriate and use as an element of their own identity, as something they want to see as an exemplar for the modern age in sort of political and moral and military sense. Like all these different ways in which the ancient world is used allow you to go in and say real things, to go in and say and draw big conclusions and draft whole new perspectives, more or less out of whole cloth, because there is so much that you can sort of latch onto, that you can comment and critique, that you can keep rebuilding basically over time. And that particular process, I think, is really fascinating, just to see that this is one of those topics where our idea of it is constantly changing, and you, as a student, can actually contribute to the way that we see this and the way that we sort of understand it better over time.
Yeah, the use and abuse of ancient history is a fascinating topic in and of itself, particularly because that's one of the few areas where you can say, if people are, complaining the ancient world is not relevant to the modern day, the way that people use and misuse the ancient world, that's something that's relevant.
This happens on sort of many levels, and some of it is extremely superficial. People will say like, oh, there's this guy in the Trump administration who's quoting Thucydides, and now Thucydides is relevant again. But that's on the very sort of superficial, basic level. But then there's much deeper things, like the idea that we are actually using Thucydides still as this sort of founder figure of international relations theory, of history, of political science, in all these different fields. Like, these sources go back to the ancient world, and our conception of them and our use of them depends entirely on 2,000 years of these people being held up as one thing or another. So it is absolutely sort of on numerous levels clear that the ancient world is perhaps more relevant to our modern society and our modern world and modern politics than almost any other historical period that you could mention.
Even though we should probably point out that that's largely because of the Renaissance. I mean, it's mostly a modern development from the Renaissance onwards where people reflect back on the ancient period and go like, this was a remarkable period of history with remarkable people and remarkable ideas, and then latching on to that particular thing.
No, absolutely. But then all of the things that they use continue to be used for hundreds of years throughout the early modern period and the modern period as ways of commenting on their own society, but also shaping ways of thinking about society, about politics, about the economy, about all sorts of things. Like, they used the ancients as exactly that kind of sounding board / lab experiment / inspiration to shape essentially all of modern science in many ways, and modern cultural thinking as well. And so, yes, it's because of sort of various waves of revival and various sort of returns to this material over time that we are still sort of really working with this. But even so, it's just, you can see the extent to which it is these sources, and these sources in particular, that can keep us, excited and entertained and educated and constantly sort of working out new ways to understand them.
It seems like the modern political usage of any of this is always based on not new ways of understanding, but very old. I forgot about the Trump administration's use of Thucydides. The one that got me was, I can't remember if it was someone from the administration or a senator, used the barbarians at the gate metaphor for immigration control once again in this country. And I mean, it seems like a lot of popular figures have a view of the ancient world that's still stuck in a very 19th century, if not, even slightly earlier interpretation, which I think is one of the most valuable things for especially young scholars to try to do, is to bring better, or at least more nuanced viewpoints and perspectives on this into a more popular sphere, or more widely known sphere.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not about sort of perpetuating this idea that the Greeks are, the fathers and ancestors of everything that we consider to be good and valuable in the civilization that we perceive to be living in. It's much more about trying to correct that image, which we have inherited from the period of the Enlightenment and the 19th century, where people are sort of saying that this is all that we'll ever achieve, and this is the best that we can hope to live up to. It's much more about sort of trying to actually go back to those sources and try to figure out to what extent we can put that in perspective.
So are you saying that you've gotten rid of your shrine to Pericles? Do you not pray to him every night?
That shrine that definitely never existed. No, but Pericles is a great example of somebody that, I have to deconstruct every single time I have to give a lecture on 5th century Athens. You just have to point out that there are rival traditions about the role of Pericles, where some people saw him as the great captain and helmsman of the democracy, and other people saw him as a tyrant. And that there are different ways that you can perceive his way of dominating Athenian politics, which really don't necessarily need to see in him some kind of ultimate example of the leader of democracy or the aristocratic helmsman of state and shepherd of his people, the kind of thing that he has obviously long been held up to be.
Yeah, and that's one of the general skills that you will develop when you study ancient history or archaeology or classics at a university level, is to think critically about everything and to basically doubt everything and not just assume simply because Thucydides wrote something or Herodotus wrote something that's gospel in some particular way. I mean, these are just very specific people with their own agendas writing something, and a lot of the time the counter sources, let's say, simply have not survived. So what you learn when you study the ancient world is how to handle your sources critically. Also applies from an archaeological point of view to handling excavation data critically and handling other people's interpretations of excavation data critically. That there is no objectivity where this is concerned for the most part, that it's all interpretation and reinterpretation and trying to create theories that best fit all the facts. The problem is that the evidence is very fragmentary. So these are all skills that you develop when you study these particular disciplines, that you get to cultivate and grow, and that's very useful, I think.
Yeah, and it's about, there are obviously ways in which the regular vocabulary and methods of scientific inquiry don't really work in ancient context, because when people say, like, where is the evidence, you can point to a lot of evidence, but a lot of that evidence is not straightforward. We can't take it at face value. We have to interpret it, we have to contextualize it, we have to get behind it. We have to compare and contrast it with different sources that may or may not confirm it. And so in a lot of ways it trains you to be really, really critical, but not in a sort of arbitrary, just criticize, just doubt everything kind of way, but much more in a sense of like exploring what it actually means to have evidence, what it actually means to know something, how we come to understand things in a particular way, and the extent to which a lot of that comes down to what you personally find persuasive, what you personally find appealing, or which form of evidence or which form of document or which kind of source you find more authoritative.
Would you agree that that's something that universities nowadays are trying to emphasize transferable skills? Would you say that that's a transferable skill?
Absolutely. Studying the ancient world, you learn nothing but transferable skills. It's not just about the idea of like, oh, let's tick a bunch of boxes. Let's go with like, oh, you learn to read critically, you learn to write an argument, you learn to present stuff. Like, sure, that's true. But you also learn to think specifically, not just critically about a thing, not just critically about a topic that you happen to choose, but you can use those skills elsewhere. But like we've been discussing, you learn to look critically, specifically at these very important foundational documents that continue to have an enormous influence over the way that we think and look at ourselves and look at our history. So it's not just transferable in the sense of the skills themselves, but it's transferable in the sense that this teaches you something about who you are and who we are as a group.
Yeah, I once wrote a blog post about ancient history where there's sort of this idea that if you want to study the ancient world, all you have to do is basically read Thucydides And there you go. You have the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is something that's common among amateurs, but it sort of misses the entire point of why this is, why it takes years to study to become a qualified ancient historian or archaeologist or classicist or whatever. That's the value of these kinds of having these disciplines taught at university level and having people actually go through the trouble of pursuing these particular studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing that I found myself doing when I hear people saying like, "Oh, I want to get into ancient history. Where do I start?" I actually tend to dissuade them from just diving straight into the primary sources. I tend to tell them like, don't just read Herodotus and read Thucydides, because you need to know how to contextualize these things before you can really get anything out of them. You need to be able to see where they fit, not just in terms of chronology, like what events they describe, which you need to probably sort of get a handle on before you dive into the text and get all these details. But also you need to understand like in what context these things are written, in what kind of tradition, what kind of genre, what kind of intellectual environment, like what produces this work, how does it end up having the shape that it does, how does it end up choosing the topic that it does, what kind of things does it think are important. And it's only when you have that sort of framework that you can look at a source and actually, get the most out of it.
One of my favorite examples are the different things that Herodotus does, the different motifs that he uses. For example, somebody failing twice and then succeeding the third time, like with Pisistrates trying to establish tyranny in Athens. He tries the first time, he fails. He tries the second time, he fails. But he tries a third time, and then he's successful. And that's something that you see happen again and again. And then it's funny to see a history book where you have the author write very dutifully, well, Pisistrates tried to establish tyranny the first time and he failed. He tried it the second time and he failed again. He tried it the third time, but then he was lucky. Whereas, if you analyze Herodotus, you see that pattern repeated again and again and again. And you see that among other ancient historians as well. And another favorite thing, for example, is the Greek or the advisor that the Persian king doesn't listen to. So there's this very wise figure giving advice to the Persian king. And usually it's a Greek giving advice. And then the king dismisses the advice because he's foolhardy or he's arrogant or whatever. And then, of course, he conducts his own plan and he fails. And then the lesson is, if only he had learned the advice that he ignored. You see that also in later sources with Alexander, for example, where the Persian king doesn't listen to the advice that Memnon of Rhodes gives. And then, of course, he is defeated and the road is open to Alexander to basically conquer the entire Persian kingdom. If you don't recognize those particular tricks, those particular themes, then it's... You just don't understand the sources and how they were made. And that's one of the things that education helps with.
I have a similar problem anytime one of my friends asks about early Rome, because it is something I talk about constantly, and I think I've generated at least some interest with my friends who are more casually acquainted with the early or with ancient history. And it's a nightmare trying to explain to them how to try to begin studying it, because even pointing them towards like the major syntheses of it just doesn't feel adequate, because there's so much historiographical sludge to work through to really try to even begin to understand it, that I have been a bit discouraging when people have asked. Not dissimilar from what it sounds like Roel has said to people.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a big theoretical framework basically, and a methodology that you have to get acquainted with before you're able before you should be let loose, let's say, on the source material, on the evidence, whatever it is.
Well, I don't mean to turn this into too much of an elitist narrative. Of course, it's accessible to all, but there is a real risk that, which I encounter a lot, because of course, as I study military history in particular, you get a lot of people who are they're really fascinated by it and they read more on it and they just sort of get into the primary source material, and they come away with sort of very strange and either outdated or misguided conclusions, not because they're not able to understand what the words mean on the page, but because they come into those sources with particular expectations, and because those sources don't sort of work hard to discourage that. But modern scholarship has obviously, with the tools that we've just now listed, gotten much further along the road of trying to understand and contextualize what these things actually mean. And so you can sort of take a very easy shortcut to sort of understanding this fully. But at the same time, I don't mean to suggest that this is something that only the university educated are going to be able to dispense this sort of wisdom. It's much more about being willing to have your expectations challenged and not taking the sources at face value.
Yeah, not taking them at face value. That's the key takeaway, I think.
And you have to be willing to put the time in. I think the part that discourages a lot of people in that, or just from my personal experience seems to discourage a lot of people, is that it does take a lot of work. Despite not trying to sound like an elitist, it does take a lot of work to actually be able to engage with our source material on that level, which is, I guess, why people like us exist.
Well, I mean, there's obviously many ways to take it, and it's like we said before, this is to a large extent about different interpretations, neither of which is objectively correct. So it's not about sort of trying to get people to see the light or to understand that with all this apparatus, with all this learning, we suddenly sort of have the key to understanding this. It's, there are obviously anybody's engagement with these sources is in itself valid. It's just much more about, trying to let people understand that there is more going on than the simple sort of text on the page, and if you've read everything, then you know everything. Which is in itself one of the fascinating aspects of ancient history, is that we're continuously coming up with new ways to read these things and with new interpretations of them and the kind of things that they tell us. So it's not just about sort of reading a text and saying, well, there we are. It's about sort of constantly reinterpreting or reanalyzing what that actually means for us and what we can get out of that and what kind of arguments we can make on the basis of the texts that we have, and the archaeological material, the numismatic material, and the epigraphic material, and all the other material that we have.
Yeah, it also requires you to be reflective of the kind of baggage that you bring to something as well. Because if you're, depending on your political viewpoints or your background or your education or where you were raised, you will look at something differently compared to somebody who had a different upbringing, a different background, different political ideas. And that's also something that you sort of have to learn. You have to learn, where do I come from, and how does this color my view of the evidence, and where does this other person come from, and why do they have this different opinion? That's sort of like this additional dimension that is added to the complexities that are already in place, let's say.
I think I was very lucky in that regard, coming out of a general history department that was stacked with a lot of people that are very aware of their own biases, and at least from an American perspective in history programs, at least any programs that I know of, you go through at least almost your entire final year working through things like that and trying to deal with the philosophical side of the work itself, especially identifying your own biases or the biases of earlier authors, especially for our field of ancient studies. I think that identifying the biases in earlier work is just as important as identifying your own. I don't know if you experience that in an archaeological program.
Well, no, you do, because with archaeology, you get a lot of archaeological theory, at least depends on the university that you attend. But when I studied at the VU University, and we got a fair level of archaeological theory, so you get the different main archaeological groups, let's say. So you have the cultural historical approach up until about the 60s, 70s, when you get the new archaeology, which they try to become more like an exact science, and then you get in the 80s and especially 90s the post-processual archaeology, where they basically say, the most extreme version is everything is subjective. There is no right way to look at things. So I have this particular interpretation based on what we've excavated, and if you have a completely different interpretation, that's fine, because we all interpret in a way that suits our own needs and our own political biases, basically. So I was very conscious of all the different ways that you could look at evidence, and you can also see that in a way that people used to do excavations. I mean, if you look at an older excavation, it's very frustrating the amount of data that they didn't record because they didn't think it was important back then. Plant matter, who cares? We're here to excavate the nice pots. Yeah, we dug up all these nice pots, and we also had all this garbage that we threw away. Whereas nowadays we're like, no, we want the garbage. The garbage is the really interesting stuff. That's what we want to look at. So when you're in archaeology, you're very conscious about the changes that the discipline went through over time and how everything became more professional. And especially nowadays where the idea is we don't excavate. We excavate as little as possible, except if we really have to excavate, if we really have to remove this from the soil, then we will excavate. But otherwise we will just leave it there and cover it up and protect it and hope that in the future wiser people than us will be able to have a look at this in a way that is not destructive, because excavation after all is unlike, you can read Thucydides without having to actually destroy Thucydides. But when you're an archaeologist and you excavate a site, you basically destroy a large part of the evidence that you go through, all the soil data, whatever. You just hope that the guy excavating it or the woman excavating it records everything correctly, so that you can still reinterpret the data later if that's necessary. So archaeology is very conscious about all the changes that the discipline has gone through.
Sort of extending from that is the fact that we also have to be terribly aware of the perspectives that our sources take, because the number of things that we actually have are very limited in terms of where they come from. Like, all of the ancient authors are essentially elite men who themselves represent to a large extent the perspective of their own social economic environment. And there are huge swathes of the population who are essentially not represented in any form of evidence, including, in an archaeological sense, of course, because most of what remains, most of what actually lasts through time, is things that are made out of materials that don't decay, such as metal and stone, which obviously represents the means of the elite and not that of the poor. There's this great quote that I read somewhere in an article on ancient Macedon, of which, of course, there's almost no literary evidence. And it said, the poor lead biodegradable lives, which is something that you have to bear in mind whenever you're studying the past, is that everything that essentially pertains to the bottom, maybe 90% of the population, will have left very little trace, except in obviously like chance excavations, like these great enormous sites like Herculaneum and Pompeii, where you actually get a sense of what a city would have looked like and how people would have lived, how different social classes lived together within that space. But for the most part, especially when you're learning, when you're using literary evidence, you're getting the perspective of a very narrow set of the population.
Yeah, tying into this, Joe Hall, because I posted about this on Facebook and Twitter, and Joe Hall, who will join us in a future podcast undoubtedly, asked a question that ties into this, which is, do you find it hard to connect with the common people of the ancient world, given how relatively little evidence there is for their lives?
I think from my perspective, working on the central Mediterranean roughly from the dawn of the Iron Age into the 4th century, it is fairly difficult. Throughout Etruria, really, I think anyone who assumes that the burials that we've excavated are anything but the elite are overreaching. And, especially for early Rome, where there's so little evidence for anything, I think the common people are completely lost to us, unfortunately. The only kind of interesting perspective we have from Etruria is a little bit later than actually the period I really care about. I shouldn't put it like that. The period that I mostly work on. We can actually trace, and a couple of people have done this, you can trace the evolution from slave to freeborn families or free families through funerary epigraphy, because we have Lautni or Lauthni as a name taken up by freedmen or freedwomen. And it's interesting to be able to see, that kind of class within society lift themselves up, or not necessarily lift themselves up, but people and families transition from one completely opposite end of the spectrum towards the more elite side. But even then, the details of their lives are essentially lost, except maybe in the recovery of manufacturing. That's one thing. Maybe even in Athens, you could say that we have an insight into the lives of at least some the common people in the Keramikos.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to be really careful not to sort of presume that, I mean, especially with literary sources where these sources often will talk about other people or represent other people or, give other people a voice to some extent, but then you still have to be aware that voice is being written by a member of the elite. The selection of what is being represented is being chosen by a member of the elite. So the extent to which that gives you a handle on the common people is actually really, really difficult to establish. So it is only in like more democratic elements of society that we can sort of get directly at them. So yeah, I mean, some forms of material remains, archaeological remains of houses, of common everyday household objects. Yeah, I mean, most funeral monuments that remain obviously are also just very, very elite forms of commemoration. So it's rare that you'll find something that really reflects sort of an ordinary life. But that said, I mean, I think a lot of the things that you talk about when you're talking about ancient history, even if they're not necessarily written by or preserved by or reflected on by the common people, they involve those people in many ways. When you're talking about warfare, that involves a huge swathe of the population, if not absolutely everyone, when cities are under siege or people are being dislocated. When you're talking about politics, that involves a huge swathe of the population, at least all the adult male citizen population of a city-state. When you're talking about something like the adoption of a cult, you're talking about how common people see the world. You're talking about how they arrange their cities around the things that they think are important, and how much they're willing to invest in sort of trying to make that a part of their lives. And so there are ways in which you can, I think, relate to that. Ways in which you can look at that and make those people real, make those people at least seem like human beings that you can at some level recognize as such. They're not just numbers, they're not just sort of being mocked as sort of subhumans, they're not just being sort of reflected on only as a collective, as a sort of troublesome mob. There are various different perspectives on them that you get out of the source material, and in that sense I really don't find it difficult at all to get a sense of them.
It's interesting that you mention warfare in that sense, because I think what literature we have on or what evidence we have on siege warfare really, or at least Greek sieges, really does bring forth the common person's perspective, not only towards warfare and death, but also towards civic pride and the relationship of, not necessarily the political or economic elite to where they live. I mean, if you read it, the few accounts of Greek sieges that we have, I mean, you have emotional outcry from not just the powerful men who are out fighting as hoplites, if you will, Roel, but you have the women or their wives, you have their older family members, their children, all identifying with the polis or with their settlement, and kind of our only evidence that they felt like they were part of this, even if we kind of lose them in the political machinations that we read about.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely the problem with the sources, that they, it was decided early on by people like Herodotus and Thucydides that politics and warfare was going to be the subject of historical analysis. Like, that was what history was going to be about. So it is only in those contexts, and especially warfare, that we see, full characterizations of communities struggling for survival. But of course, you have to imagine similar ways in which every single subset of the population was involved, also in in religious festivals, in agriculture, in trade, in all these kind of different aspects of the ancient life, about which our sources are all too often silent.
There's one other aspect. If we're talking about why would you study the ancient world, which is that the ancient world can also serve as a source of inspiration, especially in for example, popular culture. If you look at stuff, we talk about the use and abuse of ancient history of the ancient world. If you look at stuff like 300, which is some topic that we will undoubtedly revisit at some point. We still never did a proper talk on the 300 sequel also, so we probably have to do something with that. But you have this it's the world's greatest comedy ever.
Themistocles riding a horse on a ship. Okay, we've just discussed the best part of it.
Jumping with the horse out of the water.
Oh, yes.
Ship-to-ship cavalry
jump up
combat.
like a killer whale. Anyway, Yeah, but it's how you can be inspired by the ancient world to do something creative with it. Basically, that's the whole idea. So why would you study the ancient world? I would say another thing is it can serve as a source of inspiration for you to write original stories or whatever, and it can also help you in interpreting other people's creative endeavors. You can say, hey, this science fiction story resembles whatever, something from the Iliad, or it's clearly inspired by. I wrote a blog post on Star Trek and classical history, for example, that goes through all the things, and sometimes the inspiration is very literal, and sometimes the inspiration isn't very literal, and you have loads of different examples from pulp fiction to modern movies and comic books and whatever. Wonder Woman is a good recent example where you can clearly see this is a new creation that was inspired by ancient sources. And the interesting thing with Wonder Woman is that it of course works in this there's this tension between the fact that most of the writers that we have from the ancient world are men, and we have this Amazon as a lead character and a window into the ancient world, let's say. So that's another interesting aspect. Why would you study the ancient world? It's one, to be more creative, and B, to also better interpret creative works. Again, it also ties back to all the art that was produced in the early modern and modern eras, where if you don't know something about mythology, if you don't know something about what it means to have this apple in a painting, then you're going to lose out on a lot of stuff. So
I think that's not only a good reason to study the ancient world, but frankly, for people to read more in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of tying into this way. It's a source of ongoing frustration for me that there is basically no pop culture about the period that I study, because I study the classical period, and generally movies about ancient Greece are sort of either about the Persian Wars or about Alexander. So that basically means it sort of bookends the period that I actually look into. But you can see that there's a lot of stuff that works off of what the ancient Greeks wrote and what they imagined about the world. And one of the things, the most recent example obviously is Wonder Woman being an Amazon. Like, this is absolutely tying into the way that the Greeks perceived sort of the barbarian other. But also like all the slew of mythology movies that have come out over the last few years, the Clash of the Titans, the various Hercules movies, that basically just do the same thing, where they use elements of stories that we're familiar with from ancient Greece and tie them into sort of more modern, exciting, spectacular, displays of cinematographic, extravaganza. And this is all really like a way of using that material and using the fact that we know this material in order to tell very new stories. And that's a very exciting thing to do with ancient history, but also a very exciting reason to study ancient history. And I mean, there is absolutely at least one reason I can think of that people are more interested in using and adapting mythological elements and stories from myth rather than history, is precisely because, as we said, most of history has been written by these elite men representing stories of politics and war, whereas mythology much more often has a much more diverse cast, has much more personal stories, much more emotional baggage and message. And it's much sort of ties in much more directly to our concept of what a story is and how it develops and how it works and how to get sort of an emotional payoff out of it. So there's always like very good reasons why, movies are constantly being made about things like this in particular.
And with that, we wrap up our very first episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. I would like to thank Josh and Roel for taking part in this particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to visit our website, www.ancientworldmagazine.com. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and hope to see you again in, maybe a few weeks, who knows. We'll try to get a regular schedule going. Be sure to tell us if you like this, subscribe, etc. If you have any questions, be sure to contact us via the usual channels. Thanks. See you next time.